Let's face it, in our busy lives, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. In fact, according to the CDC, only 1 in 10 Americans are eating the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables each day, missing out on essential vitamins, minerals, fibers, and antioxidants. And that's where Balance in Nature comes in. Balance in Nature sources only the best produce, free from pesticides, heavy metals, and harmful bacteria. And Balance in Nature is the best fruit and vegetable product on the market. They use only fresh, whole fruits and vegetables inside each capsule. They don't use any GMOs, fillers, binding agents, or preservatives of any kind. You're getting real food, real science, real nutrition. I would never endorse a product that I don't use myself, and since using Balance in Nature, I feel more alert, I have more energy, my focus is sharper, and I feel great. Live life to the fullest and choose Balance in Nature. And guess what? P.A.S. Report listeners can get 35% off the first preferred order. Start getting the recommended daily amount of fruits and vegetables you need by using code PAS at balanceofnature.com.
Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano, and I want to start off by letting you know that I have a very special guest coming in on Monday, on the 25th. I'm not going to tell you who it is. I got to tease you a little bit, but you'll have to tune in to find out. Trust me, though. He's a great man, a great patriot. You're not going to want to miss what he has to say. As for this episode, it's clear to anyone who has eyes and ears, anyone that has a brain, that this administration continues to push a failed agenda with no signs of reversing course. Any of you out there could see this. Anyone who has had to fill up their tanks, purchase groceries, run a business. When you look at the images coming from our southern border, the videos of illegal immigrants being transported to all areas of the country in the dark of night, when you watch the botched withdrawal of Afghanistan in horror, any number of the administration's policies, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. You understand these failures, and many of us are feeling these on a daily basis. As we continue to feel the effects of this failed agenda, we see President Biden's poll numbers directly correlating with this. If we want to talk about unity, there is something that Americans are finally unified about, and it's our dissatisfaction with this administration. Even a majority of Democrats don't want Biden to run for re-election. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean that those Democrats want to or will support Republicans. And while many Democrats are unhappy with President Biden, they think the problem lies within him. What they don't realize is the problem lies with the agenda. Biden's agenda is the Democrat Party platform. It's the Democrat agenda. It's the same thing. And so they don't realize that it's not President Biden that's essentially the problem. It's the agenda that's the problem. However, as most Americans grow increasingly frustrated as their lives are becoming much more difficult, Democrats, along with the advocacy news media, who serves as nothing more than a political activist and a mouthpiece for the DNC, they're going back to the one card that they know how to play very well, and that's the fear card. If you've noticed, over the last 2 weeks, they are ramping up the fear-mongering in an attempt to salvage and try and limit whatever losses they're going to have in the upcoming midterm elections. And fear can have a profound effect. And we all witnessed this over the last few years, right? There are so many people out there who are susceptible to this type of fear. That's the scary part. I'll explain it all. Before I do, make sure to click the follow button so you never miss an episode of the podcast, and visit the PAS Report website, pasreport.com, sign up for the newsletter. And I'm going to get to the failed agenda in a minute and how they're ramping up fear, but I briefly want to comment on President Biden's trip to Saudi Arabia. I know I said something Monday, but I want to go a little bit more in depth because so far the news coverage continues. It's crazy out there. So many people are focusing on and criticizing the president, including Democrats, Republicans, and the press. And I routinely criticize this president. I don't mince words. Obviously, I think he's thoroughly incompetent. He's suffering from dementia. I disagree with just about every one of his policies and policy positions. In less than 2 short years, he has essentially destroyed this country. He's been a failure by every metric. But I have to defend Biden because everyone's criticizing him because he fist bumped Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The coverage of the fist bump has been nonstop, and it really is much ado about nothing. I don't really care about the fist bump. If you want to criticize the president for visiting the Crown Prince and groveling to the Saudis to try and get them to increase oil production, that's fair game. If you want to criticize the president for not confronting them over 9/11, that's fair game. However, to even bring up the fist bump and make that as the argument.
Who the hell cares?
Seriously, it's ridiculous. All these phony public virtue signalers keep bringing up the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and are basically advocating that we cut ties and isolate the Saudis. And these people have no idea about the complexities of foreign policy. First of all, if you want to be pissed at the Saudis, be pissed at them for 9/11. I mean, what happened to Khashoggi was horrible. It reflects the brutality of the Saudi royal family. But if we're honest with ourselves, they've been a brutal regime for quite a long time, and there have been thousands of Khashoggis murdered under this regime. Why is Jamal Khashoggi any different? And not to sound heartless, but I would think the nearly 3,000 Americans that were savagely murdered on 9/11 are far more important than Jamal Khashoggi. We should know what members of the royal family were involved in 9/11 and whether or not those people have been held accountable. And if the Saudi royal family didn't take care of those people itself, essentially killing them because they are a brutal regime, then those people need to be turned over to the United States immediately so that we could prosecute them. Secondly, the same frauds criticizing the president, they remain silent on this 9/11 issue, but they also remain silent about Communist China's widespread human rights abuses, including sending Uyghurs and Christians to re-education camps, which are nothing more than concentration camps. Instead, they're all chummy with their communist masters. These fools won't even admit that the likely source of the coronavirus, which has taken over 1 million American lives, originated in the Wuhan lab. And they don't do that because they don't want to upset their communist masters. They don't want to lose out on the Chinese dollars coming their way. Now, Biden isn't the first president to meet with tyrants, and he won't be the last. In the real world, you have to deal with some really bad people. And given the threat Iran poses, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. International politics is complex. It's a chess match where you have to be 3 steps ahead of your opponents. Unfortunately, the United States has been playing checkers as the world, particularly China, plays chess, and even down to Saudi Arabia. So I think Mohammed bin Salman's about 35 years old, 36 years old. So when we look at it, when 9/11 happened, he was what? 13, 14, 15 years old? Well, he should be willing, because he probably doesn't have a lot of close ties to those people that may have been implicated in 9/11, and even if he does, so be it. He should be willing to turn over those names. You know, the American people need the truth. Like I said, if you want to criticize the president for begging the Saudis to produce more oil, that's fair game. It's pathetic that an American president would go overseas to Saudi Arabia when we could create good-paying jobs here for Americans, produce our own oil here, and not be dependent on one of the most conflicted regions of the world for a resource that we have tons of. And this is the problem with the United States. Rather than talk about substance, they sit there and they talk about a stupid fist bump. We base everything on emotions, and guess what? The world doesn't care about your emotions, and neither do I. Sorry, but 9/11 and 3,000 American deaths are far more important than Jamal Khashoggi. And maybe, just maybe, they should use the Americans that died instead of a foreign journalist that most people have no clue about. Maybe all these frauds should be much more angry about that than they are about a stupid fist bump. Maybe the fraud should be much more concerned about Chinese companies buying nearly 200,000 acres of American farmland over the last couple of decades, illustrating how a hostile regime is gaining control over parts of our food supply. Maybe we should get more upset about that. So it's just something to think about, because it was really annoying just watching, fist bump, fist bump, fist bump. Forget the fist bump. I want the substance. Moving on to the next topic and getting to the meat and potatoes of this episode, it shows that there's no regard for the American people. And the examples I just gave show that 9/11 is not important enough, but some foreign journalist is, to bring up P.A.S. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But there was a very important announcement. You may have missed it this weekend, and I have both good news and bad news for you. First, the good news. Lord Fauci, the embodiment of science himself, was giving an interview with Politico, and he announced that he will be retiring at the end of President Biden's term. That certainly is good news. To me, this guy should have been out 2 years ago. Even more, he should have been prosecuted for committing perjury in regard to his role in the funding of gain-of-function research, and how, after being exposed, the NIH decided that they were going to change the definition of gain-of-function. There's been numerous cases where he may have committed perjury before Congress. In my opinion, that he may also have criminal violations for potentially using government resources, the government apparatus, to target and go after any scientist or doctor who dared to criticize the embodiment of science himself, our dear Lord Fauci. At the very least, those scientists that he did target should have a civil claim, given that we have Lord Fauci's own emails talking about this collusion of targeting those that dissented from the narrative. No government official should ever be able to target and engage in character assassination because they don't toe a specific narrative that the powers that be don't like. This isn't the Soviet Union. This isn't communist China. And while we may be trending in that direction, we're not there yet. In the interview with Politico, Lord Fauci said that he wants to work towards reinvigorating trust in science. This coming from one of the few people who weaponized science, who single-handedly destroyed science. And I want you to think about it. The CDC and the NIH were well-respected government institutions prior to March of 2020. Then Lord Fauci and Dr. Birx became the face of the COVID pandemic, and throughout the pandemic, they attempted to shut down any dissent, because we all know that when you criticize Lord Fauci, you're criticizing science itself. This coming from the same guy who said privately, cloth and surgical masks don't work and only give you a false sense of security. He said that to his friend in an email. A few weeks later, he stated the same thing publicly. Then weeks after that, he said that he lied because he wanted to make sure that those who were on the front line of the COVID response, that there was enough masks for them. Then it was one mask isn't good enough and you need to wear two masks. Then you needed to wear them indoors and outdoors. Then those that were vaccinated don't need to wear a mask. Then they did. See where this all gets bogged down and confusing? I mean, statement after statement contradicts previous statements. And the whole thing that's so frustrating to me is the studies we're in prior to the coronavirus and throughout the coronavirus. We all know cloth and surgical masks are ineffective. Yeah, you may sit there and try and pretend that they actually work. Well, it's better than nothing, better than no protection at all. That's one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. It's like, a person has a broken condom and they say, well, it's better than nothing. It doesn't work. They do nothing. I'm not going to sit here and beat around the bush. The science has been there the whole time. Then you factor in how most people never wore them correctly in the first place. They would constantly reuse the mask. They touch all over the mask. They put it in their pockets. Disgusting germs all over it. And you realize how these nasty cloth masks and surgical masks become a health hazard. The only masks that is effective are the N95s, but that would do away with the whole I wear my mask to protect you and you wear your mask to protect me narrative, wouldn't it? See, it doesn't work. They can't control. If we give people the choice, if you want to wear a mask, then so be it. Put on an N95 and leave everyone else alone. What's really amazing is how a study was released earlier this year. Nobody talked about it. But a study was released earlier this year showing that for the first time, microplastics were found deep in the lungs of living human beings. When reading the study, the interesting thing is it blamed it on all the microplastics in our environment, because microplastics are pretty much in everything now, and microplastics have been in everything for decades. However, what I find interesting is that this study didn't even really bring up masks. That was the amazing part, but don't you find it a remarkable coincidence that so many people were wearing surgical masks for nearly 2 years? Surgical masks have tons of microplastics in them, and all of a sudden we just happen to find microplastics deep in the lungs for the first time. I mean, what are the chances of that actually happening and not being directly related to each other? But we can't state the obvious because we're not supposed to talk about that. Instead, we're supposed to pretend that the masks actually protect us, even though we know they don't work, and we know that surgical masks contain microplastics. They destroyed an entire generation of children by forcing them into isolation. They masked kids up for 6 to 8 hours a day. They pushed their social, emotional, and cognitive development behind. They had my kids masked up for nearly 2 years, but people like me are the ones to blame for politicizing science, right? It's not Lord Fauci or Dr. Birx or these phony public health officials or Empress Hochul and Emperor Newsom. These people have some nerve. See, then you factor in the vaccine. Now, again, I am someone that believes that everyone makes their own choices. They have to weigh the benefits, the risks, and maybe potential downsides. Remember when all these frauds said that if you get the vaccine, you won't get COVID? You won't get COVID. Then it was, well, you needed to be vaxxed and boosted not to get COVID. And as cases amongst the vaccinated and boosted continued to rise, they said, well, it lowers the severity of symptoms. That's what the vaccine does. And I'm sorry. But why are we still calling it a vaccine at this point? When you get vaxxed And then you get boosted every 3, 4, 5 months. And the only thing that it may do is lessen symptoms. Explain to me how that is a vaccine. I guess I'm not part of science. I guess I'm one of those Neanderthals that can't understand this. Because when I actually use my brain and look at other drugs out there, take Tamiflu, for instance. Tamiflu, if you read the instructions on Tamiflu, Tamiflu is used to alleviate flu-like symptoms and prevent complications from the flu. So if the COVID vaccine is just to alleviate symptoms and prevent complications from COVID, why is it still called a vaccine? Last I checked, Tamiflu is not a vaccine for the flu. There are no signs that it's going to be labeled a vaccine. It certainly doesn't have the potential to prevent the flu from happening. So if Tamiflu is not a vaccine, how is this called a vaccine? And at least Tamiflu doesn't have the potential side effects that COVID vaccines have. I know, I'm speaking blasphemy now. I'm not allowed to talk about these things.
And so, as a blasphemer, you are to be stoned to death.
You know, some of these poor demented souls would actually agree with that. They'd actually want to see that happen. I'll be accused of wanting people to die. Yet the same people are the ones who destroyed lives and livelihoods, all for a vaccine that isn't really a vaccine. I mean, how many people have been fired and lost their jobs all because they didn't get a vaccine that does nothing to stop spreading and transmitting the coronavirus? And we still have people today losing their jobs. But we're just supposed to sit here and pretend like this is normal when it's anything but. Then they wonder why we're divided as a society. Then they wonder why we're factionalized. They wonder why people are so angry and frustrated. You have these little Mussolini wannabes throughout our government who weaponize science, marginalize anyone who dissented, and went so far as to destroy people's economic livelihoods in the process. But they didn't just destroy their lives. Those that complied, those that were overly obedient, and did everything they were told, how many of their lives were also destroyed because of all the fear-mongering out there? And what I mean by that is I was on Twitter, lurking on Twitter. Social media is the biggest cesspool that we have, I'll tell you that. But I came across tweets that I found really disturbing, and I want to read some of those tweets because when you dig deeper, you see how frightening this is. And one person wrote, quote, "Just tested positive for COVID 1 month to the day from the first time I had it. I never stopped wearing a KN95 mask indoors, took precautions, even though my doctor said I should be fine for 3 months. I'm sharing so people can know it can happen and as a reminder to keep taking care." End quote. This is a person who is vaxxed, boosted, masked up everywhere, indoors and outdoors, and they got COVID twice. You would think that she would say, I did everything I was told and I still got Rona twice. So maybe all these precautions aren't really working. But of course, she's blaming it on the unmasked and the unvaccinated. In another tweet, this one from a doctor, he writes, quote, "As a physician, I have been using N95, taking all precautions for almost 2.5 years. I am fully vaccinated and boosted, but now I have COVID. No one should let their guard down. Keep masking up. Protect yourself and loved ones from this vicious BA.5 variant." Seriously? I mean, in his own tweet, he states that for almost 2.5 years, he has been taking every single precaution he possibly could. In the very next sentence, he says, don't let your guard down and to keep doing the things that obviously didn't work to prevent COVID in his case. Then you have this gem, quote, "I also wear an N95 mask indoors, except when I'm with my immediate family who I know are all vaccinated and boosted. I still got COVID, but I won't give up my family to the disease. It may be that I didn't change masks often enough, but COVID is everywhere." And this was a reply to a tweet. Quote, "I'm so sorry, I don't follow you, but I've had it 4 times over the last 2 years. I'm probably behind on my last booster, but I've had it so many times that I'm slacking on it. It sucks. I hope you rest and feel better soon." End quote. Like seriously? You had it 4 times over the course of a year, the last 2 years, and you've had the vaccine, you've had several boosters, and you still think it's working. Okay. And then you have this one. Quote, "I also just recently tested positive for COVID. The first time I had it. Hope I don't get it ever again. Just a note, I had 2 jabs, 2 boosters, and didn't keep me from getting COVID." End quote. And here's another one. I saved this one, the best one for last. And I can go on and on all day with these because they're all over the place, but this one really proves my point. "I haven't done anything for 2.5 years. I wear N95 indoors. I recently attended a company event. 1 beer on an outdoor patio with vaccinated, asymptomatic colleagues. I was there for an hour. Multiple people were infected, including me. We sat 4 at a standard patio table, umbrella above, 2 rows of tables along the sidewalk. There were people around, but not overly crowded. No hugs, no handshakes, no touching shoulders. When the event continued inside the restaurant, I went home. I stay far away from others. When I get gas, pay at the pump every 2 months. I order groceries and everything else online. I work from home, no visits with anyone. I wear a mask everywhere. Zero doubt that I and others got it at the unmasked patio event, end quote. So here was an outdoor event where everyone was vaccinated, no one was showing symptoms, and he got it. How sad is that? You know, when you read it, it sounds like satire. This can't possibly be true. But it's not satire. Here you have someone who has isolated themselves from the world for 2.5 years. They've lost over 2 years of their life that they're never getting back. He's vaxxed, he's boosted, he wore his N95 religiously. And you could tell from his other posts that he is someone who cut out anyone who didn't believe in vaccine mandates or mask mandates or anything like that. You could tell him he cut them out of their life. He did everything, yet he still got COVID. Now, I haven't changed my lifestyle at all outside of the hard lockdowns from March of 2020 to June of 2020. I've been at crowded events. I've shaken hands. I've spoken to people, given plenty of speeches. Every few months, I get tested to see if I have any of the COVID antibodies, figuring, have I ever come into contact with the virus? Do I have these antibodies and just didn't know I had COVID? And every time I get tested, no antibodies. Now, I guess I'm just an impeccable physical specimen. Watch, now I'll be the idiot that dies from COVID because I've mocked it. So, in all seriousness, though, I'm not telling anyone what to do with their life and what not to do. That's on you. You guys get to make your own decision. You're quite capable of making your own decisions. And that's what I'm saying. Everyone needs to make the decisions for themselves. Everyone gets to make their own choices. I chose not to live in fear. I chose not to be a prisoner to fear. I chose to live my life, and I'm going to continue to do so. Here you have people that have literally isolated themselves for 2.5 years, still got COVID anyway, and they still think these things work. And why are we still firing people for not getting the vaccine? I mean, you know, it would be one thing if the vaccine did stop the spread and transmission of coronavirus. But all those who were fired should file a class action lawsuit immediately against their employees, especially those that still are enforcing vaccination mandates, because there's no justification for these policies. If vaccinated can get coronavirus and could transmit coronavirus, then what is the justification for vaccine mandates at that point? If it's all about the severity of symptoms, that it reduces severity of symptoms, okay, that affects then those that get the vaccine, well, they'll have their severity of symptoms reduced. Those that don't, they made the choice not to get vaccinated. So if their symptoms are more severe, then that's on them. What are we doing here? But it's about the fear. That's what it's about. I find the number of posts declaring how many people got COVID and then go on to say, however, thanks to the vaccine, the symptoms aren't too bad. You would think these people would be a little angrier that they did everything that the Faucis of the world wanted, that the Faucis of the world were telling them to do, and yet they still got coronavirus, even though they were extremely careful. But the officials are at it again, and of course, the activist news media is running with it because it's all they got to distract us from this failed agenda. They're talking about the surge of increases in cases. They're talking about orange and red zones. They're recommending the same failed policies that didn't prevent the spread or transmission of coronavirus in the first place. And here's the thing. You know, this isn't rocket science. Every 4 months, we see an uptick in cases. Every 4 to 6 months, an uptick of cases. Then a month later, the cases come crashing down. 3, 4, 5 months later, the cases go back up, and then they crash down. So we see this cycle continually playing out here in the United States and around the world, and nobody thinks to say, hey, let's readjust our strategies and maybe figure other things out. Maybe we should just do more for those that are at high risk of getting complications from coronavirus. Maybe that would make more sense, but we don't operate in common sense anymore. And if you don't do what these powers that be want, you are an immoral and a horrible human being. You want grandma and grandpa to die, they say. You have these blue states and blue municipalities itching to reinstitute unconstitutional mandates. And sadly, you have some ordinary people actually encouraging it. To say it's disturbing would be an understatement. But that's not the only fear they're pushing. For the last 2 years, democracy is under a direct assault. That the fascist pigs, the ones who advocate against forced mandates by the government, are seeking to end democracy and usher in a totalitarian state where ordinary people get to make their own decisions. Ordinary people get to decide for themselves. Imagine that. Imagine this horrible totalitarian state they're looking to create. The goal of these people. There are some in the Democrat circles and the media allies who said that Democrats need to make the 2022 elections about the Republican war on freedom. And this is laughable. I mean, listen, I don't make this stuff up. These people are insane. They say that because the Supreme Court overturned SCOTUS, the United States is becoming a fascistic police state. See, it doesn't matter that the court returned to the principle of federalism, the way our country is supposed to operate. And I don't care where you stand on the abortion issue. Everyone gets to make up their own mind. That's the beauty of the United States, that we all get to choose where we stand on this issue. There are some people that are going to be pro-life. The majority of Americans believe that there should be restrictions when it comes to abortion. And then you have the far left that says abortion anytime on demand. But we, as people of states, should now get to decide these issues. However, according to these loons, allowing the people within the states to decide the issue through their elected representatives is apparently anti-democratic. Anti-democratic. Instead, they believe it's democratic for a federal government through the Supreme Court to allow unfettered abortion imposed in every state and every municipality. They're warning that the path we're going down now, because of this decision, is going to lead to those who obtain an abortion to be charged with homicide. That's what they want. And it doesn't stop there. These poor souls say that next they're going to be going after HIV drugs, gay marriage, interracial marriage. They're going to mandate religion on everyone. Recognize that the same people talking about the threat to freedom are the same ones that advocate censorship and speech codes. They want to label any dissent as a form of domestic terrorism. These same people advocate getting rid of the filibuster. They advocate packing the Supreme Court. They advocate taking power away from the states, essentially the people, and placing that power at the federal level where some bureaucrat will ultimately decide your community's fate. They want federal agencies to ignore Congress and Supreme Court rulings, essentially doing away with the separation of powers, placing more power and authority in the executive branch. And they want to empower the president more to govern through executive action. So long as it's a president that supports their priorities, then it's okay. If it's a president that doesn't support their priorities, then that president shouldn't have any power. They want to artificially manipulate the price of oil and gas in order to socially engineer society and force Americans to purchase electric vehicles that they can't afford. And that doesn't make sense with their current position and how much money they make. They want to make it so hard to expand energy production that several states are now warning about rolling blackouts. So that's their version of freedom. These are the same people that, deep down would love to nationalize industries through the United States government. They want to keep all the power that was acquired during the coronavirus. They want to determine when people are locked down, when they have to wear masks, where you can go, what businesses are essential and which ones aren't, who can come to your homes and how many people you can have in your homes at any given time, when, where, and how you can practice your faith. They want to declare any criticism of their policies and the government as a form of domestic terrorism because they say the person is expressing anti-government, anti-authority sentiment. I mean, just remember when over 1,200 public officials signed a letter calling protests against mandates as white nationalism, a form of white supremacy. They want to force you to get a vaccine that doesn't work as they said it does. A vaccine that we have no real idea what the long-term effects are, especially when you consider the 100 boosters that you may get. Even worse, they want to destroy your livelihood when you don't comply and get the vaccine. That we now know does nothing to stop the spread and transmission of the virus. They want you to get fired. Even worse, they want parents to get children as young as 6 months old vaccinated from a virus that isn't deadly to them. Where most children, 99% of them, if they come in contact with coronavirus, they're going to be fine. Are you really willing to give your child a vaccine that we know so little about? Even if there aren't long-term side effects, why would you chance that? But then again, these are the same people, the ones that advocate threat to democracy, democracy's ending if Republicans get in charge. These are the same people that shut down over 50% of the schools for nearly 2 years, socially isolating our youth, destroying an entire generation. They want to force children as young as 4 years old to learn about gender theory and sexuality without any input from parents about whether this is appropriate or not. They want to allow children as young as 9, 10 years old to take puberty blockers. And when a student decides to transition, many of these same people don't want schools to inform their parents. Well, how's that freedom and liberty? They say they want to protect the student's privacy. That's a bunch of nonsense. I tell my children that freedom and liberty, that's on the outside. Here, when you're under my parental control, when I'm paying your bills, when I'm paying the mortgage, when I'm the one that's responsible for you, you don't have freedom and liberty. It's a dictatorship in my household. And that's the way it's supposed to be. If my kid says a curse word in school, the school's going to call me. Yet, if a child wants to make a life-altering decision like transitioning, parents don't have to be informed about that? How ridiculous does that sound? And these are the same people, again, that want the FBI to investigate any parents that complain about the indoctrination at school and school board meetings. They want to sit there and label parents as domestic terrorists. They want to eliminate our border and then take those coming over the southern border to the most vulnerable communities, impacting the most vulnerable populations already. They want to release people who commit violent crimes back into the communities they already victimized. But God forbid you make a right turn on red without coming to a complete stop. God forbid you go a few miles over the speed limit and you're going to get tagged with one of those cameras and they're going to collect that money from you, that's for sure. You know, it's amazing. They constantly talk about gun violence, but they don't enforce gun laws for violent offenders. In fact, they confiscate the gun, drop any gun charges that exist, and these are black market firearms. These are not firearms that were legally obtained. Yet many of these same people go so far as to say they want to ban guns and gun confiscation. So the same people that sit there and say that democracy is under threat, they want total control over every aspect of your life, and they want to be the ones that make the decisions for you. Is that the America you want to live in? The same ones pushing this threat to democracy narrative are the same people who have turned our republic on its head. And since we now live in the twilight zone, you have Gavin Newsom putting out an ad in Florida trying to entice Floridians to move to what he calls the free state of California. These people are delusional. They're out of their minds. And I know the America that I prefer. That I know. And that's the America I'm going to stand up for. Because you, as we the people, are smart enough to make our own decisions. And as I always say, as government has expanded over the course of the last several decades, as our federal bureaucracy has grown so massively, don't you see that the problems are much more complicated today? Don't you see that the incompetence is much more widespread today? Don't you see that these people do not solve problems? They do not solve them. They exacerbate them. And so maybe if we get back to our roots with the idea of federalism, with the idea of limited government, maybe, just maybe, we'll get ourselves out of this mess. Something to keep in mind. Now, as I said, I got a really great guest for Monday. It's not going to disappoint. I can guarantee you that. So make sure that you tune in. I hope you found the content of this episode informative. And listen, an informed citizenry is how we take this country back. That's why I hope that you share it with your family, your friends on your social media. Don't forget to give the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Take 30 seconds to write a review. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.